My name is Ralph Richard Banks, but I go by Rick. I'm wearing 3 hats here today. My first hat is, of course, that I'm an alum. I was class of 1987. I did the co-term program, bachelor's, and an individually designed major, which was a weird thing at the time to have multidisciplinarity, and then a master's in education. Anybody here from the class of 87? Yes. Not much. Okay, a little. Okay, there you go. Go class of 87. Thank you. I'm also the faculty director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, which is a recent initiative of the university. Our North Star goal is the idea of democratizing knowledge, right? And that's kind of what this is in a small way, right? To take an issue that's in the public eye and then to talk about it in a way where people can understand, even if they don't have time to spend their days thinking about this stuff. And the third role I have is, of course, I'm just a faculty member who teaches about critical race theory. I'll be teaching a critical race theory course in the spring, actually. I also have a courtesy appointment, as Mei Ling mentioned, at the School of Education. For those of you who don't know, what a courtesy appointment means is that you can teach there, but they won't pay you, right? That's just the true, right? So in critical race theory, these recent controversies bring both of these professional affiliations to light. So you all have no doubt heard about the controversy of critical race theory. It has been in the news, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. You've probably seen videos of school board meetings that look like hockey games where, you know, things come to blows. There's been a lot of activity, debate, controversy about this thing called CRT. So today we want to talk about CRT in education. And the first question is, how did CRT, I'm going to have 2 questions and then 1 wrap up. First question is, how did CRT become such a big deal so quickly, right? This was an arcane legal theory, something you learn about in law school. You take a specialized course, typically a seminar in critical race theory. How did it become a big deal so that it's on the front pages of newspapers? Second question, which is kind of prior to the first really, so maybe we'll consider that first. Second question is really, what is critical race theory? Most people, when you ask, they don't have a real clear understanding of what critical race theory is, because there's a lot of talk about it, but there's not a lot of factual information about it. And then the third thing I want to do is to just give us a take home, right? This is in any sort of class, you want to have a take home. Often the take home is that you have an assignment, you're going to produce a paper. We're not going to do that today, but I do want to give you some things to think about at the end in the terms of what to make of this controversy. So, where does critical race theory, how did it become so controversial so suddenly? Short answer, part of it is that man right there. Not the handsome black man, that's me, actually. It's the other guy, right? The other guy is Chris Rufo. I'll tell you more about him later. But he actually deserves a great deal of, could we say, credit for taking critical race theory from being an obscure academic theory to having it be splashed across the pages of newspapers and a staple of talk television. But we'll come back to him later. But for now, let me tell you, and this is in that video, by the way, I've done a couple of sessions with him. I think for the Wall Street Journal, I think that one's from the New York Times. This is a podcast, which is actually a good podcast. Water states banning when they ban critical race theory in classrooms. This is the New York Times podcast, The Argument. So I'll give a little shout out to them. And they worked wonders because we did an interview, and the interview I thought was really horrible. It was just kind of disjointed. We were talking in all these different directions, but they edited it together really nicely, right? So it came out well. So that's a good primer, if you want, on the critical race theory controversy. Okay, now let's go back and talk about where did critical race theory come from? Like, what is it? What's the there? Critical race theory started in the early 70s. It's hard to define in terms of identifying these elements that clearly differentiate everything that is critical race theory from things that are not critical race theory, right? And it's hard to define because there are a lot of people who are doing it, right? Or who say they are. And if you identify as a critical race theorist, then that kind of makes you a critical race theorist, right? So it's kind of hard to define. In the same way, it might be hard to define the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or maybe not, but it might be hard to define, a political party because you have a lot of different people within the party. And different people want different things, and you have different elements of the party and all of that. So I'm not going to offer you kind of a recipe for critical race theory, right? Here are the 3 elements of it, because you can't really do that. But I will give you a sense of where it comes from, what's the origin, and then what's the center of gravity of it. What's the essential characteristic of critical race theory? Critical race theory begins with this man who was a friend of mine, a mentor who I miss dearly. This is Derek Bell. He was the first African-American professor at Harvard Law School. He grew up as involved in the civil rights movement. He was a civil rights lawyer. He worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. As some of you know, that goes by the initials LDF, which is, historically has been the most prominent civil rights organization in the United States. LDF is the organization that Thurgood Marshall was at the helm of when he litigated all of the segregation cases that culminated in Brown v. Board of Education. Right, and I don't want to take anything for granted here because I know this is people have different backgrounds. Brown v. Board of Education, decided by the Supreme Court in 1954. It was a unanimous opinion, one of the most momentous decisions the Supreme Court has ever issued because it overturned the system of de jure segregation in public schools. Right, so schools throughout the South in particular were formally segregated by law. And this segregation, of course, is not just about keeping kids separate. It was really about giving black students inferior education. It was about expressing a message of degradation. It was kind of a way to extend slavery by another name, right? I mean, this was not a good system. Brown v. Board of Education was the case where the Supreme Court famously said that segregation is inherently unequal when it's enforced by law. Right? So Thurgood Marshall argued that case. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. Derek Bell was kind of the next generation. He was one of the lawyers that came in and said, whose job it was to enforce the decree. Right? You had to go from segregated schools to desegregated schools. So that was his job, and this man had no shortage of energy. He spent years, a decade in fact, going all over the South, trying to desegregate schools, and eventually he became frustrated because, as it turned out, schools were not desegregating. 2, 3, 4, 5 years after Brown, virtually no schools had desegregated. Right? In fact, even 10 years after Brown, there was less integration in the sense of black students going to schools that had been white. There were fewer students who had done that than there are people in this auditorium right now. Over the entire swath of the southern United States. So there was no desegregation practically, even though the Supreme Court had decreed that desegregation was constitutionally required. So Derek Bell began to scratch his head, right? He got really frustrated. And critical race theory began really with him. I mean, and there are many people who've been involved in this, but he is pivotal. Critical race theory began with him asking himself, why or how could the Supreme Court decide in our favor, yet 10 years later, it still doesn't seem that we won? Nothing has changed. How is that, right? And that's the animating question of all of critical race theory, really, is how can things seem to be moving ahead, seem to be changing, but then not, right? And Derek Bell developed a lot of ideas around that question. And this was the headline, and the headline when Brown was decided. One of the ways in which he reformed our thinking about the role of race and law in American society is that at the time Brown was decided, people thought, okay, we're leaving racism behind. Now we have formally equal school systems. Everything is fair and square. And Derek Bell said, no, you're kind of imagining that racism is something we've left behind. But in fact, he thought racism was something that was central to American society. And that explains why Brown was not able to be implemented as the Supreme Court expected. Right? There's some school districts, in fact, that decided when Brown was decided that rather than integrate the schools, they would just close down the public schools. Right? Anyone here from Virginia? Yes, what county was that? Do we know?
Prince Edward County.
Oh, there you go, thank you. That's always give a student the time to think about it, right? You can, anybody else from Virginia have this? Yes. No, is it Prince Edward? Okay, we'll stick with Prince Edward. Okay, so it was Prince Edward County, right? So they closed down the schools, right? And this is just an example of the extent to which racism was kind of embedded into society. And it was so embedded that it actually warrants a rethinking of the effectiveness of formal changes in the legal system in producing real change in people's lives. Right? So if we were in a law school class, we would call this the critique of rights, right? We imagine that if you get a right, it's going to change your life, right? Whether it's the right to free speech or the right to Second Amendment, right to carry a weapon, or the right to be treated equally to other people, we think that's going to change your life. But the rights don't always translate into changing lives so easily. And so critical race theory was part of a rethinking of the role of rights and the inevitability of progress in American life due to the persistence of racism. And this insight about Brown was an important one because, of course, we've seen this dynamic before, right? This is a scene from Reconstruction. So the Civil War ended. The Reconstruction Amendments were passed, right? The 13th Amendment prohibits slavery. The 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Amendment, that's the Equality Amendment. 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights. And then Congress said, look, we can't just stop slavery. We got to remake the South. We have to allow the freed slaves to really become citizens. So we tried that, but then 10 years later, Reconstruction ended as a result of a contested election. And that's what gave rise or allowed Jim Crow to grow, right? And that was and we should be clear that while we think of Jim Crow segregation as about separation, it wasn't really about separation. Separation was really a means to achieve something else. Separation was a means to an end, right? And the end that separation was in pursuit of, I didn't realize this when I was in school. I learned that segregation was about separation. It seemed sensible. But then I would talk to my parents, and they were both refugees from the South. My mother came from Alabama. For anybody here from Montgomery, a Highland Home, Greenville, that area. My father came from Lithonia, Georgia. But I asked my father one time, how did they happen to come north? And he told me something I didn't understand at first, but then it made sense. He told me that he came home because his brother made a mistake, his older brother. And I said, what was the mistake? He said his brother made the mistake of wearing a new suit into town. How's that a problem, right? He said, well, this was, years ago in the midst of de jure segregation. His brother wore a new suit into town. It was greeted with taunts from the white kids there. Who's the nigger in the new suit? That's what they said. Who's the nigger in the new suit? The very act of him wearing a new suit into town was just more than they could bear, because that unsettled the racial hierarchy, right? This is a hierarchy where not only could black people not look white people in the eye, if you wore new clothing that might suggest, you were better than someone else, that could cost you your life. My father's most vivid memory from this, because he wasn't with his brother when he went into town, but he did run behind his brother as his brother had the shotgun and he fed him shells that he used to ward off the mob that had followed them back to their house. Before the sun set that night, he was on his way to Cleveland. And they never went back. But that's what segregation was. This is not atypical. This is representative, right? And as representative, of course, of the, the centrality of racism, racial hierarchy, investment in racial hierarchy in the society, right? As we might say in Silicon Valley lingo, Derek Bell's view and in the view of many critical race theorists, they say racism is not a bug so much as a feature, right? It's just we're in Silicon Valley, right? It's not a bug, it's a feature. So we've seen this story. This is the same story with Brown, where things went backward. We see this with the civil rights movement, right? Extraordinary movement, Martin Luther King, 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination across many realms of American life, 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, unprecedented federal legislation, yet what resulted after that is something that people have with justification called the new Jim Crow, right? Which is incarceration rates, which are the highest in the world by a magnitude. And African Americans are disproportionately represented among that group, right? And if we look at people who aren't incarcerated and we look at things like wealth disparities, we see the same sorts of disparities, and they haven't really closed in the last half century, right? So we had this great advance. Things really changed in some ways, but then they didn't change in other ways. And then, of course, the last great advance, which led our children to wonder, like, why were Mommy and I so excited about this election, right? And what this meant. And you may all remember all the conversation that, like, now we really are a colorblind society, right? I mean, this is like, we're there. We've done it. Something that frankly, even most black people did not think this would happen early on, right? We didn't think it would happen. But then, we also didn't think would happen. Maybe I should have anticipated this, that we would then have someone who would rise to political prominence by arguing that this man was ineligible to be president because he was not an American, right? Because he was born somewhere else and, was a Muslim, right? That was this sort of claim that was in the air, right? So again, same dynamic. We're moving forward, but then again, we keep moving back. How do we explain that? Critical race theory doesn't provide, people don't provide unitary sort of answers, but they do recognize this dynamic. Okay, so that's what critical race theory is. That gives you a sense of the lens through which critical race theorists view the world. Racism as feature, not as a bug, something that's inherent rather than something that's ephemeral. And that warrants a rethinking of our justice system, the criminal justice system, of the courts, of the role of law, all of that. Okay, now let's go back to why, though, critical race theory became such a big issue. Because it was out there for a long time. And it became a big issue because of Christopher Rufo, who I mentioned, who focused and is really brilliant on, critical race theory is kind of made for controversy. Because you have theory, which people are kind of disinclined toward, is critical, people don't like that, and then you're talking about race, right? So, extraordinary combination. But the stage was also set by another man, who is an unwitting participant in a horrific way in this whole controversy. And that's George Floyd, right? Because when George Floyd was killed, that made people of all backgrounds and around the world sort of rethink the role of race in American society. It wasn't just about police violence. It wasn't just about criminal justice. It was about this whole thing, right? How can this be happening in the 21st century? Right? That's what George Floyd made us think about. And that made everyone, in some sense, or many of us, into critical race theorists. And one example of that is the 1619 Project. This is a project that, by and large, doesn't involve lawyers, but it does involve the same, or draw upon the same sensibilities that are reflected in critical race theory, right? Which is the centrality of race and racism rather than thinking of it as peripheral. seeing that justice has been biased in some way rather than is blind. Right? Now, the hard thing here, though, is that critical race theory on one hand and the anti-critical race theory folks on the other, they both have genuine visions of society. And those visions are actually legitimate. Right? That's the hard thing here. So on the one hand, there's equality. On the other hand, there's racial hierarchy. Or we could think of liberty on one side and property in the form of slavery on the other. The hard thing is that both of those stories are legitimate. We were founded based on an ideal of freedom, but there also was the reality of slavery. That's real. And there are many different examples. This another example is that, we talk a lot about being a land of immigrants. And that's true. We are a land of immigrants. If I were to ask and people to raise hands, lots of you would be children of immigrants. But it's also true that starting in our very first naturalization law in 1790, the only people who could immigrate to this country and become citizens were, in the words of the statute, quote, free white people. That was the law. And that was started in 1790, and that continued until the 1950s. So this is not, 100 years. It started then and continued until the 1950s, and it wasn't until 1965 when the immigration law was overhauled to actually make immigration truly, less racist and more sort of, allow people from all different nations to come in, right? And that's been reflected in the changing populations of places like Stanford, post-1965 immigrants. So, but both of those stories are true. Nation of immigrants, also restrictions on immigrants in the sense that we are, quote, a white nation. So the question is what to do about that. What we need is more people to understand the complexity of our history and of our identity, right? It's a mistake, I'm going to tell you, it is a mistake if you hear these two stories, the Christopher Rufo story and the critical race theory story, and you select one or the other. That is actually replicating the problem. What we need people to do, and this is what we strive to do at the Racial Justice Center, what we need people to do is to actually recognize the legitimacy of the sentiment, perspective, feelings, values of the people that you might vehemently disagree with. Because it's only through recognizing that the legitimacy of their views that you can understand the deep dualities of American identity, culture, and history. Right? So we need you to do that. And that's, I think, the antidote to the polarization that we're experiencing right now in the nation. So the Racial Justice Center, we think of this project of recognizing the dualities, embracing even those you disagree with. We think of this as a project of undermining both ignorance on one hand and certainty on the other, right? Because those are both scourges in our society. There's too much ignorance and there's too much certainty. So as you think about, your institution, participating in politics, or in your own life, I hope that when you leave here, you all can make the effort to be cognizant of the importance of undermining ignorance and certainty, both in yourselves and in others. Okay, thank you.